Good morning, all of you. Today we have Professor Soumya Brother Chowdhury from the School of Arts and Aesthetics at JNU. He will be giving a public lecture this evening, but as the tradition of the Swasthya Rasa Bodhini series goes, we also have a brainstorming session with the expert so that we have a few minutes, maybe an hour to know his interests more and also to share our questions and perhaps also share some of our comments and ideas. Today's focus topic is the question of philosophy, art, and mathematics in relation to models of formal thinking. And first of all, I welcome Professor Soumya Brother Chowdhury to NIAS. And it's really wonderful that he's here. And I also want to thank Dr. Saurabh Todaria for arranging and facilitating his visit, and who will be chairing this morning's session. So, Dr. Saurabh.
So, on behalf of our chairperson, Professor Sangeeta ma'am, and our NIAS CSP team, I welcome Professor Soumya Chowdhury. So, Professor Soumya Chowdhury is a well-known scholar in continental philosophy and in theatre and in the theory of the theatre and performance. So, to give a very brief introduction of him, he did his PhD from Center for English Studies from JNU. Then he has been the fellow in the Indian Institute of Advanced Studies, Shimla, CSSS Kolkata, CSTS New Delhi. And currently he is an associate professor in School of Art and Aesthetics, JNU. And he has published a lot, and some of his major works, his first book is Theatre Number Event, which is basically a relationship between the theatre, philosophy and mathematics. And his recent book is Ambedkar and Other Immortals, an Untouchable Research Program from the Navayana Press. And his forthcoming book is on the weight of violence, which is forthcoming from the OUP. And
okay, that came out.
Oh, okay.
Edited by Satya.
Oh, I see. Okay. Sorry. So basically, so besides, he's also into the theatre production and scripted, directed, and acted in the many plays based on the Dostoevsky, Chekhov, and Premchand, and other thinker and other performers. So, besides, he also facilitated many workshops with NGOs, especially for the differently able people. So we welcome you on behalf of our NIAS CSP. And so for this brainstorming session, as I'm told that we should start with our introduction, and then we can introduce ourselves and our work to the Professor Soumya Chowdhury, and then we can take up the questions regarding the theme, and that the discussion will carry on. Yeah. So I think we should start with the introduction of
So you want me to?
Students,
Sure.
yes, scholars. Yeah.
My PhD here. So I'm working here as a research associate and doing my PhD.
Right.
So my area of research is in Indian aesthetics, particularly on Dhwani theory. So I'm looking into how Dhwani theory can be used in visual aesthetics and in performing arts in that sense. So I'm taking the performing arts, like particularly folk performing arts of Kerala, and looking into that.
Right.
So I studied in DU and yeah.
Okay. Very nice. Okay.
Good morning, sir. I'm Niharika. I'm actually working here as a research fellow under Sangeeta ma'am. So I'm concentrating basically on the notion of consciousness by the school, Kashmir Saivism, the school, and the religio-philosophical movement and the development and the background of the school. I have a background in philosophy from DU, and then I did my master's from BHU in Indian philosophy and religion. So I'm pursuing, this is my second year of PhD.
Excellent.
Good morning, sir. I'm Meera. My background is in literature and psychology. I did my undergraduation from Christ University and then my master's in literature from Hyderabad Central University. I'm a PhD student here. I'm working on the connections between language and consciousness, specifically looking at the Mantravada traditions in Kerala. So I'm looking at myths and the theatrics of healing and concepts such as those. So very glad to have you here.
Very, very nice to be here. Very nice to talk.
Good morning, sir. Myself Sukanya, working as a research associate. And I'm working in the area of health, ethnomedicine, and indigenous knowledge of communities of Kerala.
All right, yes, fantastic.
Good morning, sir. Myself Priyanka. I have a background in psychology from Manipal University. Here I am working as a research associate, looking into yoga meditators and their positive psychology aspects. It's both qualitative and a quantitative research.
All right.
We are happy to have you here.
Very nice to be here. Thank you.
Good morning, sir. My name is Shweta. I'm working in the same project as Priyanka mentioned, but my background is from engineering, and so we are going to look into the quantitative part of the research. I work under Dr. Nitin, sir.
Hello, sir, and welcome to NIAS. I'm Siddharth. I'm doing my PhD here. I'm in the 5th year. I work largely in philosophy of mind on metaphysical conceptions of mental phenomena vis-a-vis physical phenomena. More specifically in that, I am looking at one contemporary family of views in Western philosophy, more specifically Western analytic philosophy, called Brazilian monism. My background is I've done my Masters of Arts in Education from Azim Premji University, after which I have come to NIAS. And welcome again, sir.
Good morning, sir. Myself Rakesh Kumar. My background is in archaeology. I am working as a research associate here. I am working in Kerala indigenous healing tradition. Basically, I am looking for the origin of indigenous healing tradition, like the placement of indigenous healing tradition before the origin of codified medical system like Ayurveda, Siddha, and other codified medical systems. So basically, I am looking from the archaeological point of view.
Okay.
Very nice to have you here, sir.
Very nice to be here. Fantastic, yeah.
Good morning, sir.
Hi.
My name is Hari Krishnan. I have a background in engineering, BTech in electronics and communication, and masters in computational engineering. I joined NIAS last year as a research associate. I'm working with Nitin, sir. So here I'm working in machine learning. Specifically, I'm trying to use the properties of brain and to develop a new learning algorithms. So we specifically look at chaos theory and try to use the properties in developing a new learning algorithm. Thank you. Welcome to NIAS, sir.
Thank you for having me here.
Good morning, sir. I'm working as project assistant for NIAS CSP team under Sangeeta ma'am's guidance.
Yeah, I thought maybe I can just expand on my introduction. Yeah, I'm an electrical engineer, but turned towards mathematics and interested in scientific theories of consciousness. And also interested in looking at the connection between causality and consciousness and learning, and mostly from the mathematical point of view. That is the kind of, yeah. Thank you.
Right, yes.
So just to tell you about what is specific.
Fascinating range of interests and work that is going on. So, I'm intimidated, a little scared. So, yeah. So, do you want me to talk about my work, or do you want me to talk about some specific questions of formalization?
Yeah.
How do you want to do this? Yeah.
So what we had in the mind when we designed this brainstorming session is that the theme of this brainstorming session is the question of philosophy, art and mathematics in relation to the models of the formal thinking.
Right.
So of course, as we know that in the mathematics and in the philosophy, formalism is very much celebrated.
Yes.
But how to think of the formalism in relationship to the aesthetic, especially in connection with the beauty.
Right.
So what we have in the mind is one way of the formalism is to see from this Western rationalistic mode, where the formalism is mainly analytical, disinterested, and as such it discards aesthetics or beauty, considering it as a subjective or emotional. But like in Kant or in Indian aesthetics, when they talk about the Rasa Shastra, so there is the relationship between the formalism and the beauty. So that is so how to think of the relationship, think of the formalism in relationship to the beauty and also with art and mathematics.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So before I respond to this extremely pertinent question, maybe. Do you want me to speak into the mic? Okay, yeah. Maybe it is fair to all of you to first be able to know a little bit about what I mean by formalization, or this question of art and formalization is presented at what level. Let's first look at it at a very common sense level of what are our associations with either of these two words of terms, art on the one side and formalization on the other side. Now, it seems to me that the common sense associations largely create a certain kind of contradiction, or at least a tension between these two terms, art and formalization. So, and you yourself brought that up, that the common sense association of art is with something subjective. So beauty, enjoyment, a certain kind of aesthetic pleasure, these are what we associate with the experience of art. In other words, art is considered to be subjectively an experience, which is apparently the opposite of formalization, where formalization seems to be something which is indifferent to experience. That experiences can vary, but something like a formalization would have a certain objectivity and a certain stability. So if you write an equation, then that equation is not immediately disrupted by experience. Experience might change, but the equation for a certain set of properties, a certain set of variables, will remain, at least within certain conditions, stable. So apparently there is a certain incommensurability, or at least a tension, between these two terms, art and formalization. It seems on the first look of it. Yeah? And yet I would like to think that art and formalization have something intrinsically, something to think about at the level of some sort of a logic which unites or binds both of them. So how does one then deal with this apparent contradiction and what I am proposing to be a deeper proximity or neighborhood? This to me is the fundamental point of departure. So I thought I should first present the overall question that for me is an important one, and then get on to the specific questions that you ask. Now, while it is true that art seems to more or less be correlated to something which would be closer to subjective experience, which we also sometimes call aesthetics, and formalization seems to present a systematic set of symbols. So formalization would be understood as something written. Formalization is a kind of writing, while art seems to be something which is a synthesis or a creation, but it's produced at the level of a particular kind of moment of inspiration or creativity. Art has something to do with creation, while formalization seems to be a systematization of several phenomena, among which creative phenomena also exist. Now, if that is the case, then we have to go back to asking the question that if art is something subjective, how is it different? What is in a certain kind of jargon you'd say the differentia specifica of art? What is the specific difference which makes art different from other experiences? So in the evening today I'm going to talk about whether an aesthetic thinking is possible, looking at Kant, for instance, where Kant says in the first critique, not in Critique of Judgment, which is supposed to be the most important book of aesthetics from in Kant's oeuvre, but in his first book, Critique of Pure Reason, he uses the term aesthetic for what he calls the very conditions of thinking, forms of receptivity, forms of any kind of organization that the mind can actually create as steps to understanding something, which he calls aesthetic. So in that sense, something aesthetic seems to be the condition for thinking, and yet not at the level of thinking in Kant. And that has nothing to do with art. That seems to be a fundamental grid or condition for any kind of experience at all. So if that is the case, if aesthetics actually seems to be correlated to to the very fundamental, transcendental field of any experience, rather than experience as such, then we have to ask, which type of experience is art? Because aesthetics seems to be covering experiences more than simply artistic experience. This distinction between aesthetics as a larger field of something like experience and art as a particular mode of experience needs to be made. And hence, the analytical question, the logical question, what is the specific difference, this differentia specifica, which produces a definition, a kind of a definition of art? And there suddenly the contradiction turns around. And you see that, and I can't develop this, but I'll put it to you as a cryptic, as a terse formulation. You see that the specific difference of art is actually form. It is the very form of art which makes art. So in ordinary discussions about art, you will mostly say, and you can take several examples of art here, visual arts, painting, theatre, literature. In each of these genres and kinds of art, you will mostly ask the question that how is an artistic form representing something which is a larger field of reality? Which means that reality itself is not at the same level as art. Art is a particular formalization of that reality. Art is a particular modality, which is also a formal modality of a reality which is more inchoate, which is larger, which is a kind of chaotic field, which is not a field at all, but something indeterminate. And art determines it, but in a particular way. And that way is the form of art. And then form can also then be subdivided into genres, into specific techniques. So literary techniques, the material of that form. So literature would have a different material from theatre, and theatre would have a different material from painting. And yet, once you make that distinction, you can also then draw, as Aristotle did in his Poetics, you can also draw an inter-artistic connection. So you can say that earlier forms of literature were oral, and a more sophisticated form of literature corresponding to a historical stage when cities came into existence became written, when writing developed in societies. This is also kind of formalization, but it's a more empirical formalization. Once you have taken certain forms of art as given, which is writing, oral literature, dance, music, then you can also empirically formalize them in a certain hierarchy of development. But of course, you realize that the moment you formalize them in that direction, it immediately becomes something which is also a hierarchy of values. So the moment you say art, which is literary art or written art, which is more sophisticated than oral art, you've already inscribed or ascribed a certain value vis-a-vis the other. So actually what you do is that in the formalization of art, you also in some way, I will not use a somewhat skeptical word like smuggling, though it looks like smuggling in, but you do bring in some oblique way, indirect way, another kind of formalization, which is not an aesthetic formalization, but maybe an ethical formalization, maybe a political formalization. So you say that writing belongs to a modern society, while orality belongs to a primitive society. That is already ideological. Yeah? So a certain political ideology is being brought in, though apparently it's being done within an intra-artistic historical formalization. So then we have to understand that formalization itself can have different sites, different, what you could call different discourses. And yet, if you take all of them together, one fundamental fact remains, or at least one fundamental surmise, inference can be drawn, that the specific difference of art is not that art is simply experience, but art is a particular kind of experience which is distinguished by the specific form that it takes, which is an artistic form. So form then actually is the essence of art. And then this apparent earlier common sense contradiction or paradox, that how can formalization of art, formalization and art be brought together as commensurate? Because formalization is on the side of objectivity and art is on the side of subjective experience, partly dissolves this tension. So this, I thought, is the first articulation that I should make before I get on to the question that Saurabh, you very, very importantly, you put to me. But I would like to ask you, since it is a workshop kind of a format, at this level or this preliminary formulation that I put to you, do you have any doubts or any questions, anything to say about it? Briefly, then we can take it up and then go back to Saurabh's question. Because I wouldn't like to take any leap. I would like to take it step by step.
So you spoke about forms of art.
Yeah.
And how form sort of gives shape to art and constructs it.
Yeah.
What about art in the forms themselves?
Right.
Like if you were to look at poetry, for instance, the very form in which it is written also adds to whatever artistic value it holds.
Sure.
So how can you distinguish between forms of art and art in the forms?
No, that's exactly my point.
Right.
That's exactly my point, that unless we recognize that there is already a particular generalized form which is art, or art is differentiated from other fields of experience by a certain general formalization, which is artistic formalization, you cannot get on to the further stage, which is a specific formalization which is also historical. So when you speak of a certain kind of poetry, then it will be a particular poetry in a particular society at a particular historical stage.
Right.
But if you say poetry as such, then you're already talking about a form.
Right.
And that form would have to be understood in a way whose language cannot be historical. Whose language has to be either scientific, which is very deductive, which people also try out. Poetry can also be almost deductively drawn out. Or it has to be like Heidegger, the great German enigmatic philosopher Heidegger would talk about, that poetry actually, or something like a general thought of poetry, has a kind of claim to truth, or claim to what he called unconcealment, or something which is the unveiling of truth, which itself is not merely an artistic concern, which is something more than that.
Right.
Yeah. So any thought is concerned with something which is truth. And the mode of access to truth can differ from art to art. So then suddenly we move from something which is intra-aesthetic, merely formal, to something which is truth. But truth is not the truth which is analytical. Truth is not the truth of whether an object coincides with itself, which analytically is also always a clarification, a lucidity. Truth is not like that. In Heidegger, truth becomes something which is in the act of that unconcealment created. Strangely, truth also becomes something creative. Yeah. So that is precisely the question, that something like a form is already part of the general sense of art, where art is not part of aesthetic knowledge merely, but art is connected to which is a stakes, which is the stakes of truth. Then we can have specific aesthetic forms like this poetry or that poetry, and other forms of art. Yeah. So absolutely. Yeah. So maybe any other question, or I can come back to Saurabh's point.
So what we have in the mind is actually, and this is the brainstorming session. So we'd like to take up more questions then, because this is also a specific issue, as Professor Soumya talked about, relationship between the form and the art. But of course, I think because the people, we are approaching this question from the different perspective, from the philosophy, science and mathematics, and from the social science perspective. So if we can take up one round of the question, and then we can again come.
Maybe what I'll do is, before the round starts, I'll briefly touch upon what you asked.
Okay.
That will be good, because you asked a very specific question about taste.
Sure.
Yeah. About something like beauty.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So yes. So now, let's talk about certain accepted philosophical definitions of not art merely, but the aesthetic knowledge of art, or aesthetics. Because after all, if you take philosophy, then by and large philosophy is subdivided in the syllabus of philosophies in the university into analytical philosophy, which is some kind of logic, into ethics, and also aesthetics, apart from metaphysics and so on and so forth. Now, if you have something like aesthetics, then already you have a particular branch of philosophy or a philosophical definition of art through aesthetics. And indeed, in that, beauty becomes a chief feature of the definition, a chief parameter of that definition. That art has something to do with what Kant calls the judgment of beauty. So, encountering a work of art, we produce a judgment. We say, this is a beautiful work of art. This is beautiful. But it is not the same thing as saying that in general we see something or we encounter something and we say, oh, this is beautiful. No. Here, the work of art produces that judgment. This is a beautiful work of art. And yet it is a judgment, because we do join a subject and a predicate with a certain copula, with a certain is, that this is something. So it is technically, analytically, a form of judgment. So that's why the question of beauty seems to be essential to the definition of art. And yet, like Saurabh asks very importantly, that how can beauty, which is subjective, which is an experience, be part of a formal judgment? So this is the fundamental puzzle of Western philosophical concerns with aesthetics. And Kant actually understood this quite well. So Kant said that it is a judgment without a concept. This is something Kant admitted, that it is a judgment. It is a form which takes A is B. The work of art is beautiful. And yet, it is a judgment without a concept. Very different from a judgment which is an analytical judgment, for which you need a concept. If I say this is a chair, then I have to have some concept of a chair. Otherwise, I can't say this is a chair. But with the work of art, Kant says that a work of art is something which produces a judgment, which is a synthetic judgment, and yet it is something which does not have a concept, or not a strict concept. And hence, he joins beauty to something which is a faculty, and he calls this a faculty of taste. Now, what is taste? Either taste is something which is anthropological, that human beings have some faculty which is part of the human constitution, which is taste. That would be a way of looking at it. Or you say that taste is something which is, again, historical. Taste belongs to a stage of social development, civilization. Only some civilizations have taste, others are primitive, which would again be ideological. Now, Kant again answered this in a way which was in the middle. He joined taste to something he called sensus communis in the Critique of Judgment. What is sensus communis? Sensus communis is a kind of communitarian sense. So it is objective. It is part not of individual, subjective, inner, solipsistic kind of a thing that, oh, I'm saying it's beautiful, so it's beautiful. No, it has to be brought out in a communitarian, communicative discourse. And yet, that communication is not the communication of a concept. So it's not science, apparently. It is communication at the level of what that community in a particular point or a moment agrees upon. So in Kant, what happens is that the kind of judgment it becomes is a judgment which is not so much a very clear, determined judgment as a judgment as an agreement. So on the one side, there is this communitarian agreement on what constitutes beauty. On the other side, there is a particular experience of a work of art, and the two more or less have to come together. They have to lead to an agreement, which leads to, and I and Saurabh were discussing this a moment back, which leads to a kind of hermeneutics. So basically, art then becomes something which you have to read, which you have to see through tradition, through your communitarian notions, but also not impose the general communitarian notions on art. So art can also be new. So how to find a kind of horizon which is both of the new and at the same time something which is part of tradition. This is the hermeneutic problem in a way which is the other paradigm from formalization. Now, the hermeneutic problem is not very keen on emphasizing too much on formalization, because formalization becomes too objective, too rigorous. For hermeneutics, a kind of interpretative freedom is necessary. Interpretative openness is necessary. And in a way, Kant gives you that kind of a opening with this idea of sensus communis. At the same time, he speaks of taste as a faculty. Because if it's a faculty, then it's a faculty. It's a constitutive part of the humans, the universal human subject, the transcendental human subject. So there is an ambiguity in Kant there, which is a general problem of aesthetics. So let me just place these remarks in the beginning, and now we can,
The floor is open for discussion, so we can ask questions, comments, observations.
Just sort of taking off from the last point that you said of what Kant, he conceived of aesthetic experience as always being located within the larger, if I can call it, the aesthetic community.
Right.
And necessarily sort of responding to, again, I'm simplifying it, the standards of the community.
Right.
Then how for Kant would the possibility of an outsider coming and even appreciating a sort of an alien aesthetic culture, which has probably happened many times in history.
Yes.
Is that even possible for somebody like Kant, or is that possible only when that outsider also becomes in some sense part of the larger aesthetic, the aesthetic community?
Right.
The more general question is, then this sort of flies in the face of the other maxim, which is sort of a popular maxim that art is universal. It is never universal then for Kant.
Right.
Would I be sort of right in understanding him that way?
No, absolutely. So this is at the heart of the difficulty with reading Kant, the ambiguity in Kant apparently. So let's take the first side of this ambiguity. So you're right, that how can there be a sensus communis without already a certain kind of cultural subjectivity, a certain cultural, a kind of acculturation, which then becomes part of, like I said, a certain empirical historical temporality. You have to belong to it, you have to grow into it. How can there be an encounter? Yeah? So if it's an alien, you can look at the alien in two ways. The foreigner is someone who comes in and suddenly meets a whole set of cultural practices that he or she is foreign to. So what happens to the status of that subject? Is she an aesthetic subject or not? That's the first question. The other question which actually Kant does deal with, this question Kant does not quite deal with in this part. There is another place he does deal with it, we'll come to that. But Kant does deal with this question within the different kinds of aesthetic judgments that he speaks of in Critique of Judgment, which is the movement from the judgment of the beautiful to what he calls the judgment of the sublime. And he says that there is an experience of art which is, to use your analogy, which is a kind of internal foreignness, which is when the person who belongs to that cultural community or that culture or identity suddenly encounters within that very field something foreign. So now the foreignness doesn't attach to the subject, foreignness attaches to the art itself. Now suppose I meet a certain kind of, I encounter some kind of an artistic experience which within my culture, while apparently it's part of my culture, I'm not able to recognize. He says this is a moment of a certain kind of disorientation, when the subject within his or her culture suddenly becomes estranged. But interestingly, Kant takes his examples in this kind of a moment of disorientation, not so much from the cultural sphere as from the sphere of nature. Nature. So he says, for instance, if I, as a city dweller, I sit next to the sea and hear the roar of the waves, and suddenly I get completely transfixed by it, where suddenly all my cultural parameters, my social parameters are challenged by an experience which I cannot grasp, cannot comprehend. Then what I encounter is something for which, so coming back to formalization, for which the form is lacking. I do not have the form to synthesize it with, and yet the experience itself is real. So suddenly real experience oversteps what in Kant is the fundamental critical point, the critical maxim, which is the maxim of possible experience. That what makes an experience possible. Suddenly the real experience is real, and yet it does not quite, it cannot quite be reduced back into the conditions of possible experience. So it's a kind of moment of negativity. It's a moment of a certain incommensurability between the experience and available form of judgment. He calls this the sublime. Yeah. So, but his examples are not the examples you are taking, which is a foreigner coming into a culture. He's saying that within a culture there are moments of estrangement. So this is interesting because you can use this same crisis, this diagnosis of a crisis, to understand both these things. On the one hand, within a culture, art also is suddenly a moment of the new, when the culture itself does not understand its own art, and yet it has to contend with it. And at the same time, what you're saying, that when a new subject who belongs to another culture suddenly intrudes upon this culture, both in that sense are moments of negativity. And in that sense, Kant would say the problem of the sublime arises in each of these cases. So that's one. But Kant does talk about the question of the foreigner in a certain way, in a colonial context, with the colonized and the colonizer. Now, as you know, Kant was someone who had a very ambiguous attitude to the most momentous event of his own time, which was the French Revolution. So Kant said something very strange. He said the French Revolution was such a bloody, messy, terrible kind of a cataclysm in Western history that if the very people who did the revolution, that is the revolutionaries, had a chance to go back to the revolution, they would never do it. That's logical because they all died. So, second time around they would want to survive. So they wouldn't, in that sense, undertake the revolution. But he also says at the same time that, but suppose someone were to think of the revolution, meaning the idea of the revolution. And he uses this figure of speech, like a spectator looks on a scene. You can think of a painting, a play, as if this revolution was a spectacle, a drama. Then the spectator, in thinking of the revolution or seeing the revolution in her mind, would feel, and he uses a very interesting word, would feel enthusiasm. Why does something which in reality is such a messy experience, as an idea produce enthusiasm? Kant says, because it shows that in a very troubled way and dissatisfactory way, nevertheless, mankind is progressing. But Kant also says, in this text and in other texts, particularly related to education, mankind is progressing. But one part of mankind, which is European society, is, in a sense, showing the way to progress. Which means all other parts of the world, like colonized societies, would now have to undertake the same path. And yet, the progress itself is universal. So he's not saying the progress is only Europe's progress, Western society's progress. He's saying the French Revolution shows all of mankind is progressing. At the same time, he says the path to mankind is shown by the European Revolution. So you see, he brings in the foreigner, the colonized is the kind of foreigner. But the foreigner is also already inscribed in a universal horizon, which is the horizon of progress. So for Kant, there can be no radical foreigner. This is the point. Kant is domesticating the foreigner. He acknowledges the foreigner, but he also domesticates the foreigner through this fundamental horizon which he calls progress. So yeah, that is a point we should keep in mind. Yeah.
When Ramanujan wrote that letter to Hardy, Hardy was a mathematician and he would go only by proofs. He saw the equations and he said some of them I know. Some equations he said they're so beautiful that they had to be true. So I think that's a good example because he is a person who will only go by truth, But here he's accepting the truth of the statement, not by the proof of that, but by the beauty of it. I thought, he's the foremost mathematician of that time. And he becomes a foreigner in that sense because, Ramanujan's equations are so sublime that, and there's no proofs given there, but still he says that it had to be true, That's probably, as a concrete example of what you...
You're right. That's a fascinating example. And I haven't spoken of mathematics, and not that I'm the right person to do it, but since it's part of the themes mentioned. So that's the interesting thing. Of course, historically one could say that different societies have different histories of mathematics, in a way. So certain histories, the knowledge of mathematics in the way we are taught mathematics, which is more or less based on a Western history of mathematics, is based on proof, is based on a certain step-by-step demonstration, which reaches a particular kind of culmination, which is proof. But that is not necessarily the way all mathematics is developed. So historically, this point is also very important. But what you're saying is, and I know of this particular exchange between the two people, is particularly interesting because it is not that Hardy doesn't speak of proof, but he's speaking of proof through a different means. See, he's not saying that I will take it to be true in the way you take an axiom to be true. It's not really axiomatic. So, because after all, even in fundamental mathematics, even with the proof method, there are axioms. And axioms are not proven, that's the whole point. But that is not what Hardy is saying here. Hardy is saying there is a proof, but it's proof in another way. And that to me is indeed exactly an example of aesthetics. Because aesthetics is also knowledge. And yet it is a knowledge without the standard method of proof. And yet if it is knowledge, there must be some proof. So that's why you have again and again this form of discourse, whether it is in art or in this case in mathematics, that I know but I know not how. Yeah? And it's also commitment, no? When Hardy says it must be true, it's a commitment. And yet it's not a commitment on the grounds of ideology, it's not a commitment on the grounds of some moral reason, it's on the ground of that it's so beautiful, it must be true. So aesthetics is also kind of commitment. A commitment to that particular moment. So yes, that's a fantastic example. Yes, absolutely.
As you mentioned that the art can be appreciated within like as a foreigner, as a, like, but very cultural aspect. But what if the culture is no longer, because culture is very dynamic. If you say that any example that civilization has declined, new civilization comes, then how can you appreciate that art was formed in that civilization which no longer exists? So what is the take on that?
So, your question is very important for that reason, for the reason that once it does not exist in a so-called living form or a form that is contemporary or contemporaneous with the rest of the world, then it is not available as experience. Because after all, we started out with a definition, and Saurabh also started with that art is a kind of experience of beauty. But if it is not available in contemporary society, then it's not available as experience. Art then becomes something which is a subject of archaeology, or even more, art becomes something which is like a fossil. So what you get is not art as experience, but signs of art. Yeah? Traces of art. Kind of DNA of art. Something which is the minutest glimmer of art. But how do you get it? You get it again through a very different kind of project, which is the project of a certain kind of an intervention. That you undertake a particular kind of archaeological project. You undertake a particular kind of a scientific project, whether it be a chemical project of looking at certain materials and testing them in the lab, and so on and so forth. Again, the experience now is not of art at all, but the experience is of technology, of the kind of technology you're using, or the methods you're using. The experience shifts from art to the way of excavating art. So that is an interesting displacement. But at the same time, you see, the moment you put this question to me, there is something already which is presumed in this question, which is that even when art is not present as an experience, there is still something like art as an object of speculation. So how do you say that there was art in, let's say, what you're working on, something in the past, in Kerala or anywhere else? How do you say? How do you use the word art? Clearly you use it because speculatively, for you there is a reality. And then you say, though speculatively that reality is there, but empirically today I have no case study. But even to say that you have no case study requires a speculative affirmation of art. So you're back to a certain proposition, which is art universal? Not universal merely empirically, but as constitutive, as a faculty. That there is, if there are human beings, then there is already art, which is also a kind of formal universal. So this is a question which is a very, very important but a very difficult question to answer definitively. Yeah? So this is something we have to keep in mind. The moment you ask this question, you're already speculatively presuming and producing a premise that there is some art. There was always some art.
When we visit any old temple, So narratives always survives in oral form or other forms.
Right,
Like suppose if you visit any Hoysala temple, there all this depiction has been done in the narrative, very narrative. They took some narrative from Ramayana, Mahabharata, and then they depicted. When we go there, the narrative is already in our mind. But when we go there, we see the aesthetic beauty, we see the aesthetic pleasure, we enjoy that art. But the culture, that culture produced that art is no longer exist. But still we appreciate that art. Then in that for enjoyment it is still there.
Okay.
But the cultural specific enjoyment, what is, because see if you'll go,
Alright, I
different
understand.
cultures say the depiction method is very different. If somebody like used to like, when you visit the Madhubani painting, the depiction of like Ramayana form is very different from the depiction of very, like we saw visit Barley painting.
Right.
So this very different form of art. But still we enjoy the narratives in the form of art.
Well, this, yeah, very interesting. Now you're asking the question, or rather, I'm hearing a question from another angle, which is, let's take the example straight away. Say a temple, a particular art which is actually hosted or practiced in a temple. So you take a particular dance form, which we know through other narrative sources, through texts, through other, evidences, that these dances were actually performed in the temple space. But today, those dances are there, but they're not performed in the temple space. Or they might be, or they might not be. So you're right, the experience of enjoyment has changed. You still enjoy those dances, but not in the same cultural context, the same cultural grid, matrix. That is absolutely true, and we know this is the case. So specific questions can be, and there are fascinating questions about what's the shift from a ritual form to an aesthetic form. So for instance, with a dance in a ritual form, there can be what certain performance scholars call efficacy. So if a dance is performed in front of a deity, in front of an idol, then that dance is not simply a performance, it's also a way of bringing the deity into the life of the community. A whole set of beliefs are mobilized by it. So the people who watch the dance are not merely watching the dance, they're also participating in the ritual. It's a kind of efficacy. While the same dance, say Bharatanatyam performance, performed at a particular civic occasion or a stage, would be producing not an efficacy, but what would be called technically an aesthetic effect of beauty, of pleasure, of grace, of other kinds of artistic rasas, maybe. Now this distinction between the very context of art, where the meaning of art changes, is something which is indeed a very important part of the history of art. Yeah? Now, see the implication of this conversation that you and I are having. The implication of this is that sometimes something is enjoyed as art at a particular time when that very thing, when it existed in its full bloom or its full power in an earlier period, did not exist as art at all. It existed as something for which the term art is not sufficiently appropriate, or it is not sufficient. So ritual is the same thing as art? Can we speak of ritual art as a commensurate construction? Not necessarily. In the history of theatre, I have done some work on that. At a certain point, something like ritual was understood to be part of a certain kind of, in Christian ritual for instance, Eucharistic mass, which is purely within the mass. So in 9th century AD, there was a French bishop who was himself a great Christian father, and he was known to be a great ritualist. That is, he propagated Christian rituals. So he wrote a big text on the Eucharist, because the Eucharist was very popular at that time. In the same way that a lot of rituals in the temples are popular in south of India. Very popular at that time. So he wrote a text. But you know something, the moment the text came out, the church actually banned that text and did a trial against this father on the charge of heresy, and the man was excommunicated. Why? He was actually talking about the efficacy of the ritual. Why the ritual, Christian ritual, was so powerful. And yet the church, which is the so-called custodian of the rituals, banned him. Why? Because he said that the rituals of the church were actually also aesthetic. They had a kind of aesthetic power. And the church said, no, ritual cannot have aesthetic power, because aesthetics is an autonomous pleasure. Ritual must have only ritual efficacy. Ritual cannot be mixed up with art. And because he said that rituals have an artistic power people enjoy, the church got scared. The church got extremely anxious. And they banned him. And he was a very famous Christian father at that time, Christian bishop at that time. So you see, in a different moment of time, the same work can gain a status of art, which in its own earlier time could have a very different status. So that, I think, is a very interesting point.
Genre altogether with philosophy, but like when you attach the word truth or experience when you see a art form, not talking about the boundaries of culture or formalization or different forms of art, but if, like, for example, an actor is performing maybe Ramayana, Ram that time is just acting, it is hard for me to imagine that he is actually enjoying being Rama, because otherwise he can't act. He has to remind himself again and again that you are an actor and you have to, portray the figure of Ram in front of the audience. But what if, like me sitting in the audience, if I don't have that experience or I don't see the truth, that art form is not representing anything. It's actually the audience which is important in, to even appreciate the form of art. Otherwise, the form or the art themselves don't exist. Like when he's talking about, the narratives of the history or some tribe. So if, like me and as an individual or people, if we don't attach the sense of experience or truth to that, what we are seeing, it's not art or it's not a form, and then the boundaries of formalization or different categories or even culture don't exist.
Quite right.
So don't you think there has to be some division of that also? Before even uttering the word art, there should be, this is the experience which we really formulate with art or we connect with art. So is there something like that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's a very real condition for art, that it must have a specific materiality, a specific reality for a particular set of conditions which make that experience possible. Otherwise, that experience remains very abstract. That is absolutely true. But what interests me further, and that was the second set of remarks that I wanted to make, is that when does that particular experience become an experience of something which is new? So, after all, it is within the culture itself, within a history itself, that there are new artistic experiments, new artistic experiences, where you're right, the very word art is not sufficiently clear to us. And yet, it is a real experience, where we are not sure what we are seeing is whether it is art, whether it's something else, and yet it is something which is producing a moment of the new for a particular historical community. To me, that is the moment when formalization is challenged by reality. Because after all formalization is, like I started out by saying, is already the codification of a particular phenomena through a set of writings, kind of symbols. Now, of course, there are different degrees of formalization. You can have mathematics where the formalization can reach a point of absolute artificiality. So that everything that you write in mathematics, not all mathematics is of the same kind, of course, but it can happen that you write mathematics entirely mathematically. Nearly entirely. Of course, some natural language elements are always there, but still dominantly mathematically. This will not be the case, for instance, with the use of mathematics in sciences like, say, biology. Biology also uses more and more mathematics, but yet biology will not have that kind of hyper-formalization that will happen in, say, pure mathematics. If you take art, obviously, that kind of formalization is not going to happen in most cases. And yet, we do speak of form as something which is a matter of objectivity. Yeah? Now, the interesting thing is, both in mathematics and in art, the question which interests me is what happens when a particular moment of crisis and change comes. A new theorem in mathematics suddenly confronts us, about which the mathematical community is unsure. And yet some mathematicians, say Ramanuja, the example that he took, or in art, in modern literature, say the work of James Joyce or Samuel Beckett, is a new kind of writing. Now, writing here doesn't mean representation. Writing here doesn't mean writing about. Writing means pure writing.
So when James Joyce uses the English language, it's the same English language. And yet, it is not the same English language. English language has become suddenly a writing which is not readable. And yet, the more unreadable it becomes, the more that writing becomes singular, exact. This is so true in science, it's so true in mathematics. Mathematics is always a kind of writing, but at some moments that writing is not readable. And yet, it is that writing which is now a new moment of mathematical invention. Yeah. So in that sense, what interests me is this moment, the moment of this indiscernibility between the form of the new and yet the new as something which is singular. And that new is not a content. The new is not Beckett is writing about something new. No, Beckett is writing about that very society about which others are writing. And yet a new writing, literally a new literality, new letter. So I think of formalization through the letter, the writing which is, an alphabet. This to me is really the further question, extending your the question that you ask. That sure, where is it that this writing is finally targeted? It is surely the spectator. So the reader cannot read at that moment, and yet without the reader, no history of writing is possible. It is this moment to me which is the most interesting moment. When you cannot read and yet you have to read. I do not understand mathematics. Why am I speaking about it? Because it gives me a test, which is what I do not understand, I pay the closest attention to. This is the thing. When is it that we don't understand something? Because our earlier codes of intelligibility don't work. Yeah, our given protocols of reading don't work. But it is at that moment that we pay the closest attention to that form as a writing. So this to me, when people read Joyce, then they couldn't understand Joyce. But what they did was pay the closest attention to the very shape of the words, the sound of the words. Yeah? So I do not understand math. I've read a lot of mathematics. I mostly don't understand it. But I keep reading it or work on it because this is what challenges me to pay the closest attention. Exactly when I do not understand, I pay the closest attention to it. In a way, the experience of art is like that. The experience of art is not a moment of, in that sense, it is not entirely hermeneutic. It is a moment of that point of illiteracy, when I do not get it, and yet I am confronted with the shape of a new word, shape of a new symbolization, shape of a new formalization. I think that is the moment when the reader, indeed the spectator, who belongs to society, of that very society, is most challenged and also comes up with the most creative response. So to me, I always ask this question as someone who is outside the field of Indian aesthetics. I don't really work on Indian aesthetics. Yet I have the foolishness to ask this question. Maybe it's up to you to call me foolish, but I'll ask it nevertheless. Is it possible to think of a new rasa? That is a rasa which is not part of the existent letters or the written rasa, but something which I would call, Tagore used this term, itihasa rasa, which is a historical rasa, which in a sense would be a conflict. Rasa is something which has a universality, and yet itihas is something which has a certain instability. And yet, can I talk of a itihasa rasa?
What we just discussed, the second question that I had in mind is that where do you relate truth to? The experience of me seeing the performance, or the actor performing it, or in the performance itself? Yeah. So where is that experience of truth, or truth itself is coming? How can we say, okay, truth of an experience is me while watching it, or the performance as such, or the actors playing the part in that performance? So is it the art which is truth, or the performer is the truth, or the person watching it is a part of it?
Yeah.
Talking about seeing it from a new perspective, how important is the narrative for that? So like Rakesh was talking about, when we are alienated from a society and we see a painting or we got a artifact from a society and we do not have any knowledge about the narrative that it was built on. So if a person who is alienated from the society is able to get a new narrative or a new kind of perspective from that piece of art, how well can, like, he'll be able to enjoy it in a different form, maybe very different from what the artists have been written about. Yeah, so that is also one form of aesthetics, right? So how important is the social reality in that sense for an aesthetic experience, like, or the cultural aspects?
So I'll go back to your question and then come to your question. So the question of truth and where does truth lie? Absolutely. So what I'm saying is that truth is something which can be understood in two ways. Truth can be understood as something which belongs to a particular community of agreement on what truth is. So for instance, if you had an aesthetic theory which is more or less accepted by a community of artists and spectators, then you would more or less talk about the truth of art through that particular vocabulary, through those particular conceptual categories. So truth then becomes also a question of what in the case of rasa aesthetics is a kind of sahridayata. Truth then becomes already inscribed in a certain fellowship, which is not the same thing with anybody, but only a certain select few can. So then truth is already inscribed in a relationship, in a grid. But like I said, what happens when the truth is challenged by a new strange reality? So then truth has to be seen in both dimensions. Now, in the first case, clearly between the performance, the actor who performs, between the spectator who recognizes that performance, and in between, which is the performing itself, there has to be a certain harmony. There has to be a certain, Heidegger would say, a world. A world has to be formed. That is, but the moment it comes to the second part of truth, when truth is challenged by a new reality, that reality challenges you to then also write that reality differently. So your aesthetics is not sufficient to grasp that reality. So from where do you get your resources? Now, most cases, it seems to me, that your resources come from the art itself. So you do not have a theory of art. You have art itself, but art itself is not merely the experience of art. Art is also the thought of that art. So you try to draw your theory from the experience of art. But to do that, the critic or the theoretician or the philosopher himself or herself must occupy the place not of a philosopher anymore, but of the spectator. So then the spectator, Alain Badiou, the contemporary French thinker, says, the spectator is the one who carries the real of art. Because the spectator is someone who is both inside and outside. He's on a kind of threshold. So the actor is more or less within the code of the art form. The outside world is more or less indifferent to it. The spectator is on the edge. So spectator carries that real. But that real is something which is rare. Only once in a while that reality comes. Otherwise, more or less, it's in a kind of community of agreement. So yeah, that would be my answer. Now to your question. In a way, it's connected to what I just mentioned. The question of truth and the question of reality should not be placed at the same level. Truth is something which belongs to, of course it is part of society. Of course it's part of social reality. Nevertheless, truth is something which is already a particular kind of measure. So Plato was the philosopher, in the evening I'll talk about it. Plato was the philosopher who subjected art to truth. But what did he say truth was? He said truth is something which is not completely relative to a particular social reality. Truth must both come into social reality but also stand outside it. So truth is a kind of measure. It's a philosophical measure, it is a logical measure, but it's also a sort of ideological measure. Truth, in a sense, must also act like a censor. So truth is both part of society, but if it is truth, it must have something which is greater than society, which is different from what I'm calling the reality of art. The reality of art is part of society, and within that society, it produces a moment of estrangement. Or it could. Not always, but once in a while. So then truth is challenged. Now, one of the so-called postmodern responses to these days is that all experience is relative. So the only way to respond to art is through building narratives about it. So your interpretation is yours and mine is mine, and we can have different points of view on the same thing. But you see, even that same thing assumption keeps coming back. Somewhere a silent way, the singularity of that work of art keeps coming back. So if it is coming back, then while it is relative to social experience, social reality, it must also have something to do with a certain intrinsic power of that artistic singularity. This is something which we cannot give up so easily, even with the narrative strategies which are always relativist. Yeah? So since you work on Dhwani theory, that's very interesting, because my colleague in also from Karnataka, Shiva Prakash, recently I heard him speak on Dhwani, and he said that Dhwani is a kind of it's a kind of resonance, of course, but it's a resonance which is also a suggestion. It is also something which produces a transformation, but in the transformation there is also a certain power of universality. It is not simply a transformation which moves from one to the other. Yeah? So that to me was very interesting, that Dhwani is something which comes back, which is a resonance, but it also produces a subject. It produces something which has the power of a truth, in a way. Yeah. So that, I think that firmness, aesthetic firmness, is also required. Yeah.
I would like to say something related with the art of ethnic communities or indigenous communities or tribal communities. I think according to the Taylor, art is nothing but it is the expression of culture itself. For pleasure seeking, they used to do. So if we used to study some art forms of the tribal community, we can study it as two things: emic perspectives and ethic perspectives. For example, emic perspective, we can see it as an insider's view. And in the form of ethic, we can see it as an outsider's view. For example, one art form of tribal community, maybe according to me, it has some aesthetic sense. For them, it may not be. So how we can tell it as an aesthetic? I can put it as a quotation. Aesthetic sense means for them it's different. For me it's different. As a researcher, it's so much different. So how we can judge it as an aesthetic judgment?
Yeah. So aesthetic judgment can be both something which proposes a particular universality, that every human being and human community is capable of artistic creation, in that sense capable of beauty. But at the same time, aesthetic judgment can be an alienating theory for what you're very correctly calling a certain history, which is the history of communities as organic, not so much to aesthetics as to culture. Yeah. So what is culture here? Culture is a kind of total experience. Culture is an experience where the efficacy of art and the aesthetics of art cannot be separated. Well, aesthetics seems to separate these two things. Aesthetic produces what Kant called autonomy. But the whole point of culture is that culture is a total work of art. A total experience. So with that kind of a total experience, the meaning of autonomy actually is a restriction. The moment you say art is autonomous and aesthetic, you actually restrict the experience of art. So you're right. So, my colleague in JNU, Brahm Prakash, has written a book recently on cultural labor and folk. So the idea of folk, or even the idea of tribal culture, is not simply an identitarian question. It's not a question of this tribe or that tribe, this community or that community. It is a question of taking art beyond the experience of a certain connoisseurship, a certain knowledge, something where art becomes part of a larger form of life. So the word folk can be understood both as a very specific community practice, which is usually associated with tribals, rural context, and so on and so forth, or folk can actually evoke its original meaning, which is people. Folk is people. Yeah? And people are political, aesthetic, ethical, and living their lives in the full sense, all in one together. So to that extent, you're right. The very idea of aesthetic as an autonomous faculty becomes a restriction on the experience of art. Because art is actually the totality of cultural life. So I agree with you there. And that is a debate with aesthetic theory that we must conduct. Yes.
So, so this is the end of our brainstorming session today, and on behalf of our NIAS CST team and chairperson Professor Sangeeta Menon, we once again thank for Dr. Shomo to have the discussion with us. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.